Episode 62, Rice in the Carolina Kitchen. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. This week, I'll be looking at how rice was cooked in the 18th century British colonies, who was doing the cooking, and just how many ways it was eaten. I will also introduce you to one of the phoniest cookbooks I've run across, and how that was actually very helpful for getting me started on this mad project. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that rice was being eaten in England before it was out there making colonies, but only in small amounts and only by the very best, or at least the very wealthiest people. Sugar and rice and cinnamon were all fancy purchased items, and fresh sweet cream was a bit of a hassle, so in its earliest incarnations, rice pudding was about the fanciest thing one could eat on the whole entire island. And to think, tossing leftover rice into milk and topping it with cinnamon sugar was a favorite sick day treat when I was a small child and televisions were heavy. Yes, it's funny how the fanciest foods of one age become the comfort foods of another. But let's move back to the 18th century and see just what was up in the colonial and the home island kitchens. For back in Britain, even as colonial rice production kicked into high gear, rice was still both a mysterious and a luxurious food. The price dropped quite a bit once the colonies started churning out rice. South Carolina and then later Georgia, after the "no slaves so we might rehabilitate the criminals and debtors" fantasy collapsed. Yes, we remember it as the Carolina Rice Kitchen, but there was also Georgia rice. See, Georgia was made a colony in 1732 in hopes that it would work as a buffer to those lousy French in La Louisiane and those lousy Spanish in La Florida. During this time, it was held under a trusteeship so it might be used as a reformative penal colony and garrison state. This lasted for not quite 20 years when the "no slavery allowed" element was scrapped. The people in charge of colony stuff decided that having the enslaved do the farm labor was just too profitable to continue to outlaw it. So in 1751, South Carolina gave up their dream of annexing poor, unprofitable Georgia, and they opened it up for the slave-grown rice business. And so Savannah got rich alongside Charleston. So coastal Georgia was as much home for rice as South Carolina. But anyway, rice cultivation, wetland and dry land, spread. It was being grown in La Louisiane as well, but that was still France at this point, and we aren't talking about them yet. So, the variety of wetland rice, made famous in the colonies and then later in earlier America, was known as Carolina Gold. Not because the rice grains themselves were gold, but rather when it waved in the fields drying on its grass heads, the husks looked like rippling gold in the sun. Oh yeah, and maybe there was that thing about how its high price as a luxury commodity was making just a few people rich. As I mentioned last week, there is a story that the wetland rice all sprang from a single bag from Madagascar. But much closer to the present, it turns out some hobbyist futzing about by a Dr. Richard Schultz and some botanical anthropology, specifically some very meticulous work by Glenn F. Roberts of the increasingly well-known Anson Mills, link in the show notes, and now the Carolina Gold Foundation have shown that a variety of grains were included in the rice kitchen. Carolina Gold type rice was simply the best known and most valuable, and intrepid genetic research points to its source being Ghanaian, firmly rooting it in the region of the Rice Coast and confirming that several varieties of this rice were present. The export rice is described as being similar to that immortalized in the modern Carolina Gold variety, with a medium to long grain. Up to 70% of the fancy wetland rice was exported. Of the other 30%, certainly some was export quality rice that stayed at home and graced the fanciest tables, but due to the relatively fragile nature of this longer grain rice, some of it broke while it was being husked, and this broken rice wasn't exported. It all stayed at home. Known as Midlands or rice grits, it had a different texture than whole rice grains, and as a result was used differently. The irony, of course, is that a fair part of the rice exported to England was ground to flour or smashed after being cooked, or cooked in so much liquid that the grains more or less exploded, for some of those fancy white foods I mentioned last week. Not to mention, rice powder was used as a cosmetic, either to make hair powder, think Marie Antoinette's like giant dews, or face powder for women and men alike. Remember, these people were crushing pearls to concoct remedies and protectives for the seasonal plague and syphilis, so grinding up pricey imported rice to look pale for parties was nothing. Which all shows rice was not particularly appreciated back in England for its taste and textures. Instead, rice was just one of those fancy foods used to prove that one was fancy, or at least rich. It was an auxiliary. To be part of stuffed birds or puddings or almond milk concoctions. What rice could really do, support big flavors or add its own texture and flavor to a bigger production, was barely explored. All of the rice dishes I can find in 18th century cookery in English cookbooks or manuscript collections have just a few rice recipes, and the character of the rice is usually overwhelmed by other ingredients. And as we all know now, other than as an occasional side, rice will go on to have very little role in English cuisine, and the cooking of rice will remain indifferent. It is worth calling out, especially right here, that the style of rice cookery used in English-style kitchens was to boil the rice in plenty of water until it was just about done, and then drain it in a colander and place it on warm ashes or just to the side of the stove and let it steam gently to completely finish cooking. This worked in fancy kitchens that had things like, colanders. On the other hand, when we get into the other style of rices that were cooked in these one-pot situations, that is where the absorption method was used. But fancy people boiled their rice, strained it, and then let it steam gently. Rice in the colonies enjoyed a somewhat different, if largely regional, fate, for rice was either exported over the Atlantic or it stayed at home. There was almost no exchange of rice up the coast of North America. So the fancy, nice rice that stayed at home was cooked by Africans and their descendants, and it would grace the tables of the southern planter aristocracy, where they wielded hospitality as soft power, to welcome, to overawe, and of course to repel, as the occasion demanded. As for the middling or broken rice that was cooked by free and enslaved blacks as well as the poor whites of the South, that was done with differing success and pride in the results. And then there was the dryland rice, the Oryza glaberrima, home or hill rice, that was grown by the slaves working in areas where they were expected not only to grow food and products to feed and enrich others, they were also expected to grow their own food. Home rice or hill rice, the dryland stuff, could be left to grow much more like other cereal grains, minimally tended alongside hardy melons, squash, greens, and a combination of kidney or American beans, and then African peas, peanuts, and sweet potatoes. This was the rice that would be grown by a smallholder farmer in the uplands as settlers and runaways carved out places for themselves in the hollers of the Appalachians, and in post-Revolutionary War British settlements in the Caribbean and then Liberia. In the southern colonies, wheat was an uncommon crop. The cooler weather and different rain cycle of its home range meant that the wheat grains transplanted from England and then Germany was not so happy in the steamy southern colonies, but the dryland rice of the Senegambia and other rices took to the climate of the southern colonies very well. In fact, going forward, it will be a plot of corn and a plot of rice that required very little care that became important parts of the farms families ran when they had no food but what they grew. In fact, some corn was preferentially left on the stalk not only to dry, but to freeze and then lie under the snow, and it was milled frozen in the dead of winter when all the chores of harvest had been completed. Now, African rice meals are not recorded in 18th century cookbooks, and alas, there's very little easily retrieved written contemporary commentary on the flavor and texture of rice. But looking at both West African food and the, quote, everybody has a version, unquote, dishes that live on at community potlucks, church suppers, and that recipe grandma refuses to write down, It's likely that some version of the one-pot rice dishes that existed all over the world were made with these rices. And this is where we stop again and call out the absorption method. This actually takes a lot more skill and patience and experience than the boiling method. I finally jumped in headfirst and did it when I made my first skillet of dirty rice. It turns out cooking all those layers of foods and then adding the rice in at the end and then letting it stew, you don't get it right the first time. It might be okay, but it takes quite a few reps and a lot of fire watching to make sure the temperature's correct until you have a lot of experience. I certainly would have benefited from getting a chance to watch people cook this a whole bunch right in front of me. And I was working on a stove where I could control the temperature easily. Anyway, Midlands, rice grits, dryland rice, all of that was cooked with the absorption method as opposed to the boiling method of the fancy rice. Rice cooking methods in America are going to develop over the years, but that's where things stand in the 18th century. Let's start at the top. What were the fancy foods of the Carolinas that were recorded by educated white women but cooked by the people they owned? At first, they were mostly the English recipes they had pulled from their own manuscript collections and the new published receipt books that they had had shipped over. These would have been things like rice puddings or possibly pies. Anyway, they were rice cooked in cream and spices and then stirred in with egg yolks nestled in pastry. These light, airy, yet rich desserts would melt on the tongue and carry the flavors of Jamaican sugar, nutmeg, rosewater, and possibly an eggy brandy sauce. Or rice pancakes, one of those made dishes that had to be cooked and sent up immediately to be finished with a sauce at tableside. Rice in its transplanted form from England's fancy tables had little variety or excitement, but on the fancy tables of what will come to be called the Carolina Rice Kitchen, the food for those tables was being prepared by people who had grown up with rice, treasuring rice, planting it, processing it, and yes, cooking it and eating it. Some for literally thousands of years. And these are the people who gave rice life in the Carolinas. There was rice bread, tomato rice, rice stuffing, rice and sausages, and rice served as its own dish to accompany a pepper pot or even those daring new curried meats, along with rice cooked with seasoned beans and rice croquettes, also known as callas, which are quite frankly a cousin of, if not the parent to, hush puppies. While wheat was the central grain to our Europeans, the West Africans brought to coastal South Carolina came from millet, yam, and rice culture. The stretchy risen doughs of wheat were basically unknown. Instead, they carried in their heads dishes that depended on rice being cooked with flavorful fish and vegetable concoctions, often laced with pepper and chilies. It was these flavors and habits of cookery that started to sneak onto the main tables covered by linen cloths. A dish of rice where each grain was perfectly cooked and stood out separately and didn't clump showed a cook who knew her business. Slicing into a boned bird that was bursting with dried fruit and nutty rice stuffing that was then topped by a rich sauce of strong broth, egg yolks, and sweet sack wine, spiked with pepper and cloves, was a way to show off layers of skills. The bird dressing and boning, the rice cookery, the heat control needed to make a silky unbroken sauce, and the possession of a pantry of prodigious dimensions. Not to mention the matching of a sauce to the season of the year and the meat that was being served and coordinating it all with the other dishes being served. Tomato or okra rice proved that one had friends or relations in the Bahamas, or maybe New Orleans, an impressive garden and exciting modern and varied tastes. And of course, pepper pot showed off hardiness of appetite and constitution, as well as the fact that you had a cow herd and a decent butcher at your disposal. Rice cooked with beans, while definitely classed as a humble food these days, and it could be then, mainly showed off the work of serially cooking beans and then smoky bacon. Remember, bacon was many smoked parts, not just the belly as we see it these days. And then rice, all in one pot, and getting all the parts the right texture and well seasoned. This is not a skill one gets by reading directions. Rather, it takes lots of watching of lots of pots, many reps, and a familiarity with local ingredients. Croquettes, those deep-fried little morsels of flavor, were a way to show off the possession of plenty of hog. While callos or rice croquettes are a way to use up yesterday's rice or yesterday's rice and beans, they also meant you had enough lard to use pots full just for frying. And in the days before the 19th century development of the true American lard hog, deep frying was its own show of power. Many sausages, even those in the old colonial days, contained some sort of starch, connecting them back to their old existences as puddings back in England. While the Scots used oatmeal and grated breadcrumbs were common in the bread-centered world, rice was common in South Carolina, so that is what would show up in sausages in South Carolina. And then there's the dish that partly kicked off this whole project, Carolina Snowballs. The first recipe of this that I found was a whole apple, the core stuffed with lemon peel, and then wrapped in a layer of rice held in place by a linen cloth and boiled. This recipe was from the somewhat infamous Lucayos cookbook. The book's introduction makes the claim that this is a book of recipes discovered in Nassau, Bahama, in the late 1950s. Possible. And that it was a manuscript from 1660 that had been used for 30 years by a noble family in Elizabethan England through 1690. All right, you English history nerds, you know the problem with that, but moving on. And then had disappeared to the world to reemerge for publication in 1960. Seems iffy. And that the name Lucayo was a reference to the name Columbus had given the islands based on some inhabitants. And this is actually not wrong. The Taino and a group that were labeled the Lucayo people were both present at the time Columbus showed up. Now, at this point in my searches, my knowledge of the American food timeline was vague, but it did have a few touchstones. One of them being that the very earliest rice was coming out of the Carolinas at about 1690. So a cookbook claiming Carolina Snowballs from 1660? Utter rubbish. Even if I gave them the benefit of the doubt, maybe this was like a last-minute addition as this mystery family got one of the first batches of rice from the Carolinas. That seemed unlikely based on how rice was used in England at the time. Even more problematic is the use of the word apple in the recipe. In Stuart England, this would have been termed a pippin, a true apple, or maybe a codling, a crab apple. And there are plenty of recipes in the book that use those terms, but the recipe that closed the case for me in my early days that this book was not quite on the level was the presence of ketchup recipes. There was nowhere in the English food lexicon until well into the 18th century that ketchup showed up. And then at the very end, there's a tomato ketchup recipe. Look, I'll explain the idiocy of tomato ketchup claiming to be from the 17th century when we get to tomatoes. But just because this book was a fake didn't make it useless, and I'll be putting together a bonus episode on this little troublemaker for those of you who are interested in how things like spelling, sentence construction, and how instructions are phrased help date recipes. The recipes are clearly copied from many sources over literally hundreds of years, and I'm sure some version of this manuscript does exist. All the same, I'll put a link to a digitally available version of this book in my show notes, and let you know when I finish my episode peeling back some of the layers of this odd little touchstone. Sure, it's a fantastic chimera, but it keeps me coming back during this journey when I recognize the appearance of another recipe found in there. And those Carolina Snowballs show up in Hannah Glass's 1763 Art of Cookery, and then on forward in time. A believable and laudable recreation with nifty pictures is done on the blog Turnspit Table, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes as well. So origin story aside, there's more to rice dishes than just the fancy ones. Just as with rum being a product of the industrial waste of sugar refining, there was a non-saleable but still useful waste stream that came from rice processing. These were middlings, or as they are written now, midlands, also known as broken rice or rice grits. This broken rice, until real mechanization, was an expected part of the rice hulling process. Rice, especially the medium and long grain rice of the Atlantic luxury trade, was thinner, longer, and markedly more brittle than the other cereal grains of its time. As a result, the European flailing methods for breaking grains out of their hulls and possibly degerming them would not work for rice, so the African technology of large hand-carved wooden mortars and pestles became a part of the Low Country rice equipment, along with the flat fanning baskets used to blow off the holes and sort out the broken rice. None of the broken rice, these seconds of the milling process, was exported. Instead, this processing byproduct was used close to the site of production. While some of the broken rice might have been used for nursery food or sold to smallholders or possibly the lower classes in the port cities, most of it was used to feed the people enslaved to grow, harvest, and process the rice. Dishes of rice porridge, rice bread, and broken rice pilaus, purlus, and jollofs would have simmered away in the group cooking pots, along with continuing the tradition of making slightly mashed rice balls to dip into okra and sassafras and peanut-thickened, vegetable-heavy stews the enslaved would have made from the produce of their own gardens they cultivated on these plantations, where they were expected to work for the profit of the plantation and to work to feed themselves. Broken rice is always going to stick together more and be softer than the whole stuff. Because its structure has been exploded, it has an entirely different aspect than the long grain, slightly firm separateness that was prized in the Carolina Gold export rice. And finally, in American food, the most mysterious rice of all, dryland rice, Oryza glaberrima. Lacking real deep dive time and resources, the chance to swim about in oceans of primary research, I cannot know what the African dryland rice that was grown in the colonies looked like, or most important to my brain, smelled and tasted like. Luckily for me, many varieties of Oryza glaberrima are still widely grown, cooked, and eaten in West African kitchens. Far more luckily for me, food blogs are not just a thing in the United States or only in the Anglophone world. And sometimes, okay, not often, but sometimes it's a good thing the internet holds on to stuff we have lost collective interest in. As a result, I was hoping to be able to look over the shoulder of people talking about the smell, taste, texture, and flavor of modern African dryland rice. Will this exploration be inexact and derivative? Oh yes. But will it give me a window into what these dishes would have been and what they might have tasted like? Also yes. And as with so many things, as a wedge into the past to make exploration interesting and possible, it does a pretty good job. Just as with the Lucayos cookbook, even imperfect information can be of use in puzzling out the past. If anything, it's helpful in reminding us that any picture we reconstruct of the past is patchy and more of an impression than a clear and exact representation. And that as much as some parts of our understanding are well supported, there are always going to be mushy spots. I also want to be clear that when I speak of glaberrima rice being lower effort than sativa rice, that needs to be understood as relative. Both sorts require large amounts of labor. And the one distinct advantage that sativa grains have is that they seem to be easier to remove from the stalk and have less tendency to shatter, giving a higher return on whole and recoverable grains. However, having lived and worked with a grain that has a tendency to shatter, cooks of glaberrima rice clearly already had methods of dealing with broken rice before it was the only type they were given to work with. Now, in the modern age, when fast-growing, high-yield sativa varieties have been developed and rice has turned into more of a cash crop than simply a home crop, higher yields have won out, even over taste or perceived goodness on the moral, spiritual, or even community level. However, as water becomes a problem and droughts become more common and widespread, the hardiness of glaberrima varieties is again of interest. Old varieties are being rescued and new hybrids are being developed, especially between the sativa and glaberrima varieties. In fact, it is extremely likely that such hybrids were being developed when sativa rice was first introduced to Africa, an event of contentious and extremely unclear date. And as I've learned from my limited research, where and how the lines are drawn, what's a hybrid and what's not, and when they happened, and how rice is sorted into one pile or another, are still being squabbled over in real time. There seems to be a lot of identity and pride tied up into how we will eventually sort out rice categories. So with all that contentious uncertainty in mind, here are the pieces I picked up about how Glaberrima rice would have been cooked and what it probably looked and tasted like. The first item of note is that while the germ of most sativa rice is brownish, the germ and hull of Glaberrima are often red or even purple to black. In fact, African rice is often called red rice when people are distinguishing it casually. How exactly this links with the tendency to color rice in many African dishes red, with tomatoes and or peppers, is a whole deep ocean of its own I dare not step into right now if I ever want to get to another topic, but it should not be overlooked. What information I have been able to dig up contend that this rice has a more pronounced, even slightly nutty or barley-like flavor to it. So its flavor is more present in dishes than many sativa varieties. To the English and the colonists who preferred their rice white and plain, there to suck up sauces or sweet flavors, a rice with a distinctive flavor of its own would have been deprecated. So yet another reason for Glaberrima rices to be sidelined in the Americas and Europe. But beyond that, there's not much reasonably accessible written stuff about the flavor and cooking habits of African rices so far. It is currently a very niche product with a limited number of things shared about it. Nearly every article starts out with a description of its wide leaf growing habit, which shades out weeds better, its hardiness in adverse growing situations, and sometimes its higher nutritional density is mentioned. Occasionally, an American chef will be sent some to cook with, and there will be a blurb about how they think it's great or something. But there just isn't much chatter about what it tastes like, what it's like to cook with. The most informative articles, mainly by Michael Twitty, do touch on its stronger flavor and tendency to remain separate and appear red. But all in all, right now, African rice is a fairly closed book to me sitting here in America. One very new exception might be a Trinidadian rice called upland red bearded rice or Moruga red heel rice. Since it grows in well-drained soil and is a rainwater-only crop, it may be a fairly unique example of this style of rice growing in the Americas. However, genetic studies detect some Southeast Asian or sativa roots, but not only and not clearly. Is it an early hybrid of sativa and Glaberrima? The fact that it traces its arrival in Trinidad to the immigration of enslaved people who crossed lines in the Revolutionary War to join the British and gain their freedom further bolsters its connection to the African home rice and upland rice traditions. And this may be the first historical food where I need to issue a stay tuned for developments, as there seems to be active development of knowledge and leads in progress. Who knew food history could have breaking news? Anyway, I'll include a link to a store, Caribshopper, where you can try this rice for yourself if you're so curious, if you live in the US and Canada. And I'll be reporting back on this when we circle back to rice in the 19th century. Alas, my turnarounds are too tight to fit in this bit of research for the 18th century. So after all that, 2 kinds of rice, fake cookbooks, thwarted research, and promises of a taste test, the introduction of Carolina low country rice to the 18th century world turned out to be rather action-packed. And there will eventually be a bonus episode at some point breaking down the Lucayos cookbook, but I fear that will take a while. It will probably include a visit to a library far away from me. That's not a chore, just something I need to fit into my life. However, next week, it's time to circle back to beef and how the American cow is developing. And it won't all be plotting, as this will also graze up against the first appearance of barbecue, which will also get its own episode. Episodes? Anyway, we'll get American cow time and introduce more controversy. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast are much appreciated and really do make a difference, along with promised pictures and links, and this time there are quite a few. I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio and Insta bio at THOA Food and in the show description.